It's a pleasure to be here, so thanks to Tom and to Pamela on the program committee for making this symposium possible. I'm going to be talking to you today about considering alternative or alternative psychological services, re-evaluation of cultural interventions for Indigenous communities. I say re-evaluation because I think there are some default perspectives that people might bring from psychological clinical science to the particular dilemma I'm going to talk about, and I want us to rethink some of those assumptions. I really have four goals for us today in this very short time, is to describe a post-colonial predicament that vexes mental health services for American Indian communities, to consider seriously the Indigenous claim that, quote, our culture is our treatment for resolving this predicament, to assess the prospects of culture as treatment from a concrete application within an Indigenous treatment setting, and to trace the key implications of this approach for a more general application of clinical science to diverse populations. Let me start by describing the post-colonial predicament. On the one hand, when it comes to Indigenous community settings, you have urgent community needs. That is, these are impoverished, high-risk settings, and we have a history of documented disparities or inequities in mental health status. These include things that you're familiar with, like substance use disorders, trauma and its after effects, and suicide. On the other hand, the mental health services that are on offer for these communities are incongruent in a couple of different ways. For example, one early respondent I talked to, who was a grassroots traditionalist living on a reservation, told me that going down to the behavioral health or mental health clinic on the reservation was akin to an invitation to the white psychiatrist there to, quote, brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. In other words, there was recognition that mental health services themselves come packaged with politics, ideology, and culture in a way that this respondent was attuned to. And this kind of concern about the cultural leanings or assimilative properties of mental health services has been attested to by community anecdote like that, but also research evidence of various kinds. In the largest psych-epi study ever done, for example, it was found that even the majority of some Native respondents in certain reservation communities preferred traditional healing rather than mental health professionals for assistance in times of distress. And in a large-scale survey in the upper Midwest, rating service preferences, American Indian respondents tended to rank in the top 10 non-professional kinds of help, but instead healers and elders and community members. So in terms of thinking about this post-colonial predicament, we have to, I think, first recognize that all clinical intervention is cultural prescription. Everything that we do with clients is culturally embedded, filled with values and assumptions, and therefore for American Indian communities, we have to acknowledge the hazards of mental health services being potentially neo-colonial, culturally proselytizing affairs. That is, that there's a kind of missionary work going on in the name of Euro-American assimilation. And so this leads us in Indian country to want to consider alternative claims by Indigenous people that our culture is our treatment. Now, when Indian people say our culture is our treatment, they mean a few things. Number one, they mean that there are therapeutic alternatives that are based on traditions, Indigenous traditions, that even if these need to be reclaimed, should be the basis for helping people in times of distress. They are adhering to or expressing a holistic rationale that's grounded not just in psychological or in physical kinds of symptoms and their solutions, but primarily in religious and spiritual kinds of affairs. That is, that the therapeutic is always and everywhere in Indian country a sacred matter. And finally, it's not just addressed to personal distress, although personal distress, of course, is a very important facet, but also to robust cultural identity in the context of a society that tried to eradicate what it means to be Indian, and community renewal and self-determination at a much broader level in terms of peoplehood and a vibrant future. Now, what might be the rationale for trying to take seriously this claim that our culture is our treatment? I'm talking in the context of substance abuse treatment in this, in particular because substance use disorders in Indian country have been described as a post-colonial pathology rather than perhaps a mental disorder. And so the rationale here is that there's many, many people in Indian country who have recovered from substance abuse problems, sometimes very severe disorders, and attribute their recovery to participation in cultural practices, going back to tradition and ceremony and so on. Indeed, there's a scientific literature that cites these same kind of practices as finding that traditional cultural practices are associated with Indian recovery from these problems. And I think we can all kind of acknowledge or recognize that there are these certain cases that you come across in your life where dramatic transformation in a person's orientation, often through spiritual means, can reorient them dramatically in purpose, motivation, spirituality, and social networks. I think of people who've gone through maybe a fundamentalist Christian born-again kind of experience who turn their lives completely around from something like substance use problems. So how would we practice a post-colonial remedy? I would suggest the usual approach in psychological science, clinical psychological science, is to start with mainstream psychosocial interventions and then secondarily figure out how to adapt these for use in diverse communities. But I want to pursue an inverted approach today, one that starts with local therapeutic traditions and then secondarily cultivates these for use as interventions in community-based mental health services. So in some ways, that's the conceptual foundation, and then I want to give you a quick illustration of what I mean. I commenced a partnership some years ago with the Crystal Creek Lodge in Browning, Montana. Crystal Creek Lodge is the residential substance abuse treatment program of the Blackfeet Nation, which is a reservation in northern Montana adjacent to Glacier National Park. It's the only accredited residential substance use treatment program administered by an Indian tribe in the state of Montana. It follows what most residential programs follow, a group-based milieu setting. Residents come and live for 30, 60, 90, or 120 days at a time. They have a structured, group-based experience day after day. All of the staff were Native, and all of the clients were Native at this particular treatment setting. I began a dialogue in spring of 2008 talking about this inverted approach, how it would be to take and look at Indigenous cultural therapeutic traditions, and then figure out how to harness those, and to work together in August of 2009 with some key stakeholders in the program to formulate an alternative Blackfeet treatment model. And in doing this, the staff there basically consulted with certain Blackfeet ceremonial bundle keepers on the reservation and enlisted the support of the grassroots traditionalist society known as the Crazy Dogs for help in developing this. We came up with a radically alternative treatment model, which was basically a summer cultural immersion camp designed for treatment clients, facilitated by members of the Crazy Dog Society who were not trained in substance abuse treatment, but whose expertise instead lay in cultural and ceremonial affairs. The goal was to socialize clients explicitly into the old Blackfeet religion, and the tacit or implicit understanding of why this would be effective locally was that healing and recovery come from spiritual practices that harness and circulate sacred power for life-giving benefits. So therapy is always and ever a sacred endeavor in Indian country, and that was true here as well. We piloted this Blackfeet culture camp in the summer of 2012, just a proof of concept. Had no idea in sketching this out and working with these interesting constituencies whether clients would even come, whether they would even invite, whether it would come off in any way that seemed like what we had imagined. It was sponsored by the lodge itself. It was staffed by the Crazy Dog Society members. And we were fortunate to get 4 male clients who were willing to go through it for a couple weeks just as a proof of concept. The camp was structured across 3 forms of activity, what I call traditional skills, cultural practices, and ritual participation. You can see the different kinds of skills here. For example, we had to set up the camp on the first day, which meant putting up all the teepees. And that is a traditional skill in and of itself because most people don't know how to put up a teepee, and it's not exactly easy. The one at the end I'll talk to you about there of this list is collecting a niskim. Niskim are fossilized shellfish that have a sacred significance. They're understood to be holy in Blackfeet society. You can pray to them and they can help you. That was one of the activities. Cultural practices include the things you see, storytelling, finding out about your ancestry, and so on. And ritual participation was really important. The pipe ceremony was key. That's how the camp started and ended. The sweat lodge was the second thing we did, which was to spend a whole day putting together a sweat lodge and going through that. And then the Crazy Dog, as a traditional ceremonial society, had certain rights, like a transfer right, that they involved clients in as well. Oops. The ethos of the camp was one in which you can see the list I have here. Leisurely paced rather than regimented in the way it was back in the treatment center for people who got up at 8 o'clock and went to bed at 8 o'clock. It was much more loosely scripted. It didn't have a schedule with everything on it that you had to do. Basically, the leaders had a number of activities they had loosely scheduled out. If rain came one day when you had to be outside doing something, they switched a different activity or something else fell through. Really important, I want to underscore how it was sensitively guided. The particular Crazy Dog members who facilitated this were really flexible and pretty open-minded and very interpersonally skilled. And so that was, I think, very important for the success of this endeavor because I suppose every spiritual tradition has fundamentalists, and if you would have someone who was really rigid in that role, I don't know how well clients would have taken to it. It was monitored by staff at the treatment center, of course, because they had responsibility for these clients. And it was very community engaged in the sense that the Crazy Dogs might have 12 or 15 people out participating in these activities in any given day. I told you there were 4 clients. So you could have maybe 20 people out doing stuff. And importantly, not everyone even knew who the clients were in these activities. So the line between clients and facilitators sort of dissolved in some ways. I think there were some memorable and inspiring activities on display through this effort. The sacred and socio-political significance of trying to undertake a therapeutic project of this sort can't be underemphasized or overemphasized. It was unrecognizable as a form of psychosocial treatment. No psychoeducation, no skills, no invitation to reflect and look inward, the usual things that go with psychological mindedness and those sorts of approaches to treatment. Instead, it was very much centered on traditional spirituality and religious experience. And among the Blackfeet, that's all based on the sun and the power of the sun, the Toji. It promoted a genuine sense of community and belonging. It bridged historical discontinuity for its participants between pre-reservation ancestors and the current modern Blackfeet life. It erased boundaries, as I said, between clients and staff in really important ways. It connected clients to Crazy Dog activities in ways that were expected to persist well beyond the actual summer camp. And people observed that it would be good for anyone in the entire community. You didn't have to be a treatment client or anything like that to potentially benefit from being involved in the camp. Indeed, I'd say the main purpose served by this camp was to help clients craft a functional, contemporary identity and mode of living that was continuous with, rather than alienated from, the Blackfeet past. Now, this was valued by clients. I asked, of course, and interviewed them when we were done and heard what they had to say about it. The things to acknowledge, of course, it was mere proof of concept, and the outcomes could not be determined from such a small proof of concept pilot endeavor. In fact, it might seem that this kind of approach could confound conventional evaluation procedures. Small sample sizes, how well can you randomly assign to kind of a spiritual approach to treatment, and so on. Which means that there are several crucial questions that remain for this kind of approach. Empirical questions include, can processes linking culture and recovery in Indian communities be harnessed and deployed as treatment? Is cultural immersion enough to truly remedy substance abuse across a range of addiction severity? And of course, logistical questions as well. Can scientific evaluation of culture as treatment projects overcome small sample sizes, constraints on random assignment, and so on? And can development, implementation, evaluation of culture as treatment projects successfully compete for research funding? In conclusion, I just want to observe that Indigenous communities frequently exhibit alarming disparities in mental health problems. And yet, community leaders routinely decry mainstream psychological services as ineffective and irrelevant on cultural grounds. Instead, in the wake of European colonization, many Indigenous communities assert that our culture is our treatment, often with specific reference to Indigenous spiritual traditions and practices. Although clinical scientists might dismiss such claims as impediments to effective service delivery, the overlooked cultural and political value of such interventions suggests that these could be broadly therapeutic in their own right. Thank you.